There's a photograph in my mind that never fades. It's not one of those glossy posters of a man in a gold suit shaking his hips under a spotlight. No, it's an image of a young man with a number pinned to his chest, sitting on a hard wooden bench in a room that smelled of floor wax and stale coffee. I think about that morning in March 1958 more often than I probably should. At the time, the world called him the king. He had the money, the fame, and a smile that could stop traffic in any city on the map. But when Uncle Sam came calling, he didn't ask for a loophole. He didn't hire a team of lawyers to find a way out of the mud. He did what every one of our fathers and grandfathers did. He stood in line. There's a profound kind of humility in that. You see him leaning over a desk, a simple number 2 pencil in his hand, when I was filling out forms that didn't care about his record sales. The military is a great leveler, isn't it? It doesn't matter if you're a millionaire or a mechanic. Once you walk through those gray doors, the past is stripped away. You're just a body, a set of hands, and a heart that belongs to the flag. I remember watching him talk to the other boys in that induction center. He wasn't holding court. He wasn't looking for a camera. He was just a 23-year-old kid trying to figure out how to navigate the bureaucracy of service. There was a quiet dignity in the way he carried himself, a sense of duty that feels like a relic from a different world today. He understood that being an American meant that you weren't above the law, and you certainly weren't above the sacrifice. He walked up to that U.S. Army Reserve poster, and for a second, you could see the weight of it in his eyes. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about a tradition of service that defined our generation. He shook hands with the local officers, not as a celebrity granting an audience, but as a man among men. There was a handshake that meant something, a silent pact between those who serve and the community they protect. And then came the bus, that big white bus with the bold black letters on the side. I've stood on those steps myself, and I can tell you, the air changes when those doors fold open. It's the sound of a chapter closing. He climbed those steps without a backward glance at the limousines. He took a seat by the window, his face reflected in the glass as the rainy streets of Memphis began to slide away. That's where the glitter ended and the olive drab began. He sat there, slumped slightly in that vinyl seat, watching the ordinary houses pass by. He knew that for the next 2 years he wouldn't be hearing his own name whispered in awe. He'd be hearing it barked by a drill sergeant, and the most incredible part, he was ready for it. He wanted to prove that he was exactly what he claimed to be, an American citizen who knew the value of his country. Inside those induction centers, there was a specific kind of atmospheric pressure. It wasn't just the physical weight of the brick walls or the rows of hard wooden benches. It was the realization that your life was no longer entirely your own. I remember looking at him in those rooms, sitting among a dozen other boys who were just as nervous and just as uncertain. Most of them probably had more experience with a wrench than a microphone, but in the eyes of the Army, they were identical. They were the draft class of '58. There's a quiet power in watching a man of that stature sit on a bench with his head down, just waiting for a name to be called, waiting for a physical, waiting for a signature. In a world that constantly shouted his name, he sat there in the silence of the bureaucracy, patient and resolute. Yet he wasn't checking his watch or looking for an exit. He was submitting himself to the same slow, grinding process that every American soldier has endured since the founding of the Republic. It's a form of patriotism that doesn't need a parade. It's the patriotism of the waiting room. I saw him standing in a narrow hallway, his back to the wall, just another silhouette in a line of young men. When he finally stood before that officer at the podium to take the oath, something shifted. You could see it in the way he squared his shoulders. When that right hand went up, it wasn't a performance for the press. It was a sacred vow. He wasn't the king in that moment. He was a citizen soldier. He lowered his hand and walked into the dim light of the barracks, leaving the fame at the door, the barracks. Now, that was the real test of a man's character. I've lived in those rooms. I know the smell of the floor wax, the scratchy feel of those wool blankets, and the total lack of a private corner to call your own. There's a scene etched in my mind of him standing by a metal locker, his shirt off, trying to fit his civilian life into a space the size of a shoebox. He was talking to the recruit in the next bunk, not as a superior, not as a star, but as a brother in arms. They were just two guys figuring out the rules of the house. He was lean, almost surprisingly so, and he looked mortal, vulnerable. Without the lights and the stage, he was just a kid from Tupelo who loved his country enough to trade his velvet for olive drab. He didn't ask for a private room. He didn't ask for a special mess hall. He wanted the dirt, the sweat, and the shared exhaustion that binds men together. He knew that the only way to earn the respect of the men to his left and right was to live exactly as they lived. And that, my friends, is the very definition of a leader. And then comes the mess hall. I don't think anything in this life levels a man quite like a military chow line. You're standing there with a heavy plastic tray, the smell of industrial grease and boiling coffee hitting you, and you're just a hungry belly in a sea of green. I remember seeing him in that line, moving through the steam, taking his portion of whatever the cooks had slopped out that morning. There was no special menu for the man who owned Graceland. He ate what we ate. He sat down at one of those long, crowded tables, and the world tried to break in. You'd see the flash bulbs from the reporters who had snuck in, the lenses pressing against the windows, and the microphones shoved toward his face while he was just trying to be a person. It was a circus, but he handled it with a grace that most men half his age couldn't muster. So he'd pick up a bottle of ketchup, his eyes focused entirely on his plate, using the mundane act of seasoned potatoes as a shield against the intrusion. He wasn't performing, he was persevering. He finished his meal, stood up, and cleared his own tray just like the rest of us. He was a soldier, and a soldier cleans up after himself. But the moment that really tells you who he was, the moment that speaks to the heart of every American family, is when his parents arrived. I can still see Vernon and Gladys walking through those cold, sterile military hallways. They looked so out of place. Vernon was trying to keep that stiff upper lip, that fatherly pride, but Gladys, you could see the cost of the sacrifice in her eyes. You know, she had that look our mothers had, that mixture of immense love and the quiet terror that comes when your only boy is handed over to a machine that doesn't know his name. They stood together in a small room away from the crowds for just a few seconds. Vernon put a hand on his son's shoulder, a firm, steady grip that said everything a father needs to say. And Elvis, he leaned in, putting a gentle hand on his mother's shoulder, trying to be the anchor for her, while his own world was being turned upside down. In that quiet frame, the fame was dead and buried. It was just a family, a son and his parents, facing a departure that felt as final as any they'd ever known. He wasn't a star comforting a fan. He was a son comforting a mother who was losing her boy to the draft. I remember my own mother's face when I left. She didn't say much, but she held on to my hand until the bus driver told us to move. Seeing Gladys do the same thing reminds you that some things in this country are universal. Duty isn't just something you do, it's something your family carries with you. He understood that. He knew that by wearing that uniform, he was honoring her, his father, and every man who had ever stood in that same hallway before him. The final image that stays with me, the one that truly defines the man, isn't from a stage at all. It's a quiet scene in a classroom-like setting toward the end of that long induction day. The reporters had finally grown tired and gone home. The flashbulbs had stopped, and the sun was likely setting over the barracks outside. In that room, he sat alone at a desk with a pencil in his hand, taking a series of aptitude tests. There's a profound beauty in that silence. He was leaning over the paper, his brow furrowed in deep concentration, completely absorbed in the task at hand. There were no fans screaming here. There was no manager whispering in his ear about contracts or movie deals. It was just a 23-year-old man, a desk, and a set of questions that he had to answer, just like every other recruit in the United States Army. Yet he wasn't performing for anyone. He was simply fulfilling his part of the social contract that binds us all together as citizens. I think about the discipline it took to stay in that chair. He could have fought it. He could have claimed a dozen different exemptions that his wealth and status might have afforded him. But he chose the harder path. He chose to let a stranger with a pair of electric clippers take away the very image the world adored. He chose to trade the silk for the wool, the applause for the cadence, and the mansion for the bunk. In doing so, he showed us that he understood something very fundamental about the American spirit. The true greatness isn't measured by how many people serve you, but by how well you serve others. When I look back at those moments, I don't see a tragedy of a career interrupted. Yet I see a young man growing into the fullness of his character. I see a patriot who knew that the flag doesn't just fly for the famous. It flies because of the anonymous sacrifices of millions of ordinary men. By becoming one of those ordinary men, he became something far greater than a pop star. He became a symbol of national unity at a time when we needed to believe that we were all in this together. So, whenever I hear his voice on the radio now, I don't just think of the music. I think of the kid in the checkered jacket sitting on that vinyl bus seat, watching his fame disappear in the rearview mirror as he headed toward a life of yes, sir, and no, sergeant. I think of the son who held his mother's hand in a sterile hallway and promised her he'd be okay. And I think of recruit 53310761, just leaning over a desk in the quiet of the evening, writing his way into the history of our great nation. He didn't just sing our songs. He shared our burden. He walked the same dusty miles we walked, ate the same cold food, and stood the same lonely watches in the middle of the night. In a world of pretenders, he was the real deal. He was a soldier. He was an American. And that, more than any gold record, is why we will never forget him. Take care of yourselves out there and never forget the value of the quiet, humble service that built this country.